Muy bien, pues vamos a dar
Very well.
inicio.
So let's get started. Good morning to all the participants and welcome to the second session of the Good Regulatory Practice Workshop in Peru that we have organized as part of the project of the Regulatory Convergence for Medical Devices, part of the Standards Alliance Phase 2 initiative supported by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, and the American National Standards Institute, ANC, as well as the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence for the Medical Technology Sector. We support for the support of all the participants and speakers that are part of the day, and the Ministry of the Foreign Trade of Tourism, the presidents of the Board of Ministries, and the Chamber of Commerce in Lima. I am Sandra Ligia Gonzalez. I am the Executive Secretary of the Coalition. I have the honor of coordinating this session. For the dynamics of the day in terms of logistics, I will remind you that this session is being recorded for its later publication on the website of the Coalition, and we also publish the presentation, the materials, and we have simultaneous interpretation into English. You have the button to choose the channel on the bottom of the Zoom. The microphones of all participants are turned off for no background noise, and we ask you to please write your questions in the Q&A session, a button you can find on the bottom of the Zoom screen as well. And we expect you to do so we don't miss any questions that are written in the chat. And the intention is for us to answer as many questions as we can. And so for those who will be participating and presenting, we'll ask you to please turn on your camera to make the work of the interpreters easier. So after the logistics, I will share with you the agenda for the day. We're going to have Dr. Miriam Peña, who is going to describe the initiatives for good regulatory practice in the country and how you can achieve the regulatory convergence. We also have the perspective of the industry, and we hope Jean-Paul Caillet to connect with us in a few minutes. And after this session, we are going to have a roundtable with a group of experts of the private initiatives who's going to talk about the control of regulatory quality. And so we are going to have these 2 moments of the most important regulatory parts, and we are going to have the ex ante control and the ex post evaluation, where you measure the level of compliance with the initial objectives of a regulation. And Sandro Stapleton is going to coordinate the second session, the president of Consultation. And so let's get started with the first roundtable. I see Jean-Paul is already connected, so welcome, Jean-Paul. The floor is yours. Please help us with the introduction of the speakers and the moderation. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Sandra, for the introduction. For me, is an honor to welcome this group. We have 2 magnificent professionals, Miriam Peña and Cindy Vasquez. And before handing the floor to them, let me comment what will be the topic of these presentations today. So Sandra has commented the general terms, but what we are going to see are the challenges and the opportunities of regulatory convergence in Peru, which is a very important topic that connects us to a key concept, which is the regulatory improvement and good regulatory practices, which are terms that are used internationally but point out to the same objective of being able to show a commitment of the government to the continuous improvement of its regulations. And the condition is to have a regulation that is effective, efficient, to contribute with achieving the objectives of social and economic development. One important part the speakers are going to comment is that, of course, a good regulations generates a series of concrete benefits to the society and the citizens specifically. A good regulation is the one that is designed, correctly implemented and reviewed, exposed according to certain standards that allow them to define how much the regulation is being effective and efficient, and with the participation of all the stakeholders, the groups of interest that have an important role as they can contribute with evidences in order to achieve the objectives of the regulation. And a bad regulation would be the ones that generate bad negative effects for companies, for the market, and the correct functioning of the economy and the society in general. Having said that, I would like to introduce the speakers because they will provide more details on the importance of what good regulatory practices have and how can they help us generate this convergence towards reaching the objectives I have just mentioned. Having said that, let me introduce first Dr. Miriam Isabel Peña Niño. Just 1 minute, 1 second. She's a lawyer by the Universidade Miura. She has a master's by the University of Peru. She has worked since 2015, has over 15 years in high management with public management, administrative work, and civil rights. And she works the subsecretary of simplification regulatory analysis of the presidents of the Board of Ministers. She's going to comment what are the concrete actions the Peruvian government has adopted to improve and enhance its regulations, the opportunities and the challenges the context presents. So Miriam, welcome. And please, the floor is yours. Thank you, Jean-Paul. First of all, I'd like to thank Sandra Lija Gonzalez, the Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence, for the organization of this event, which is, as we mentioned, have aroused some interest in many participants. And so I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to capacitate and learn more about what means good regulatory practices. As always, it's a pleasure to share these events with you. So I have a short presentation here. I hope you can see my screen. So inside the Secretary of Public Management, we have worked over the years with these topics, and it comes to the root that there is a measurement we have carried out through world rankings to see how we are at in terms of compliance of international standards or certain indicators that allow us to see how we are in comparison to other countries. So in 2019, in a ranking of global competitivity of the World Forum, we have we can see here that we have a retrocess in terms of 2018 because we were in the 63rd and in 2019 in the 65th position. And in the pillar one, in terms of institutions, we have in 141 countries in terms of efficiency of regulation and frameworks, we have the position 105, so we came one position above, but our position is still very low. And in terms of the government regulation cargo, the load, we are in number 128. And in comparison to Mexico, Colombia, and Costa Rica, we can see the difference. And this has allowed us to consider and assess the situation. So it's important to say that in 2016, the OECD has done a study with the situation of the context of how we are in Peru in terms of implementing good regulatory practices. And so with this report, they have recommended us to have an analysis of the regulatory impact and quality, because sometimes regulation has more costs than benefits, and also to strengthen the capacities. So we need a methodology with which we can assess the proposals and have a regulation at the end. They also mentioned that the political measures should happen through an interministerial and multi-sectorial articulation to achieve coherence and effective implementation. Because the regulations really, we see that at the end they don't converge. And finally, they mentioned the articulation with all the levels of government, local, regional, and federal governments. And so these are the recommendations from OECD. And we have a timeline to have some improvements in our standards. So in 2016, we have the legislative decree 1310, which has to do with regulatory quality analysis approval. And then you see the topic has been seen inside some entities, and some of them have struggled with this decree. And after the regulation is approved, you have in 2018 two important reforms. We have the Decree 1446 that incorporates in the law the modernization of management of the state as a prioritary action to promote and improve the quality of the regulations. So we have a law embedding the regulatory practices in our country. In the same year, we have the Decree 1448 that defines the instruments for regulatory quality improvement. 2019, we have the regulation with the experience we have had so far, one for the application of the regulatory quality analysis. And then you can see the history of administrative and executive activities. So we have some regulations that had inadequate or very strict requirements, so they have been adapted. In 2021, we start the second step, which is the application of the regulatory impact analysis, the ex-ante regulatory impact. And in 2021, we started with the approval for the institutional framework to rule the regulatory quality analysis. And what we have obtained so far with the development and this timeline of normative work is that we have achieved here 8 documents of policies for modernization for public management, and I'm sure we are going to comment more. And what we have as well is specifically the regulatory quality analysis. So it's all embedded with the system of modernization of public management. It's created a coordination of regulatory quality. In other countries, you only have one ministry or sometimes the private sector, but in this case, we have one multi-sectorial commission that is formed and presided by the Board of Ministers, but it also is aligned with the Ministry of Finances, of Rights, and of economy. So we have the standards the entities have, and they issue an opinion. It's also implemented the regulatory quality analysis to decrease administrative workload, and we have been able to save over 280 million pesos in this case, because we eliminate some requirements that are not aligned. And so we have this administrative workload that was not legally necessary anymore. We have also implemented and we have used apps to improve the regulatory quality. We also have instruments of regulatory quality that have indicators inside the national policy of competitiveness and productivity. And we also have indicators and particular goals to measure these items. And we have approved all those tools that we have here, the internal regulation of the CMCR, the regulation for regulatory impact analysis. We have an implementation plan for the regulatory impact analysis and a manual of RIA, so we can make a decision in terms of regulatory implementation. And also we have an agenda to consult stakeholders and the society that is going to be impacted by a regulation. So what are the regulatory quality instruments we have? So we would say that there is a variation in terms. So we have two separate things. The regulatory impact analysis, the RIA, is somehow a way to analyze the regulation that create or modify administrative procedures. So as well as procedures or services to observe the administrative workload and to see if they met the original goals or these administrative procedures that were already unnecessary and justified. And so we analyze all that and we start the system by doing so to eliminate workloads. And so it has to do with some things related yesterday. The second step is the regulatory quality analysis that goes a little beyond to observe the standards, their dispositions, and how they would improve the quality of the design, the implementation, and the enforcement of a regulation, because sometimes you have a regulation without any evidence in an intuitive way because of a political decision. But this regulation is not followed up, so we don't know if they are being enforced. That's why we created this instrument for a regulatory quality improvement. We also have a single system of procedures, which is the catalog, official catalog of all the procedures nationwide. All the entities register their texts with their administrative procedures, in the system. And when the implementation is concluded, all the entities in the regional governments and executive powers, and we are doing with the local governments as well, they're going to have everything. We have for the regional governments 80%, and we are getting to the municipalities. So we can have an official repository with all the procedures. And we also have the standardization of administrative procedures that have to do with procedure that all entities in the regional government have the licenses. So the government has requirements, some others have one, and the time of attention is changing in this case. So we have laws that are established, and we have something specifically done because we can't consider the service provision in other ways, and we couldn't have it in one rule. We have to do it in several sectors, and so we have 200 administrative procedures that are standardized.
And here, specifically to be able to comment what we do, but just to make it clear on the health sector as well. Yesterday, we were mentioning some, like, for example, manufacturer registration, origin country, where it is manufactured, analysis certificates, and etc. And in this normative aspect, who is going through this qualitative regulatory analysis? So who is going through the RQA, and it is involved with these admin profiles and these procedures. So this was already done in the first review. And as I was saying, this regulatory analysis of the administrative processes, and then we had a lot of administrative procedures of the health sector as well. And we were able to filter and go through this filter of regulatory quality analysis. And this is very informative. You guys can also check the site, and we have a lot of resources related to these entities, and you are able to also interact with the system. And what is the RIA, the Regulatory Impact Analysis? This is a process that allows for previous systematic and integral analysis to be able to identify, evaluate, and measure probable outcomes and benefits for the solution alternatives. So for the regulatory and non-regulatory points of view. So maybe a public problem that we want to solve. And considering also the identification and analysis. What does this mean? It means I'm going to solve a public problem, but this is going to be based on evidence. So we need diagnosis, studies, we need to understand where the solution can go. The analysis of different solution alternatives. As we always were mentioning, when I have a public issue, the first thing that I have is create a regulation. And with this methodology, we want to consider other solution alternatives that are different than regulation. And if at the end you think it should be regulation, then okay, but at least you evaluated other alternatives as well. Also, when we talk about the interested parts in this evolution, which is going to impact citizenship, private sector, and this will also contribute to getting, towards public policy goals and looking for the benefits that are going to justify this process. This analysis, this methodology review and filter is going to then be applied to the processes that are for general reach, but not all of them, because not all norms are going to go through here, but only for us to establish different rules, prohibitions, limitations, what is mandatory, what is accountability and all that, just to make sure that companies are going to have compliance from parts, the companies, citizenship, civil society, and limiting their rights in a sustainable way. When we talk about medical devices, for example, if it's going to be a supreme decree, it's going to have to go through the RIA, because the RIA is going to also talk about the RQA. This is the final filter that we're going to go through, right? And what is this process? What is this methodology? So you can see it here. And the RIA is not only going to be about a public matter. The entity is going to go through this process. So each entity is going to identify their public problems, and we're going to publish an agenda saying, this is my schedule, this is what I'm going to do in 1 year, this is what I want to regulate in a year or analyze in 1 year. And then they go to citizenship and they say, okay, we have this problem, yes, or no, we should evaluate problem X, Y, Z, other problems that are also showing up. And this can also generate, synergy for citizenship and all the impacted stakeholders. Then when we understand what the problem is, again, we go to evidence, we identify and develop the goals of what we want to accomplish with this analysis. We identify and develop the alternatives for solution. As I said, we're always evaluating it and evaluating the other solution alternatives as well. We evaluate the impact to choose the best solution alternative. If I have a regulatory project, I'm going to evaluate what impact it's going to have. And if I also have another alternative, I'm going to evaluate the impact of that alternative to measure and decide which one is better. On this first process, we're going to go to public consultation, which is in its early stages. So just meetings, audiences, so that we can really try to identify this proposal of identification. Once we have this process done, and I understand that we're going to develop regulation, then we go to phases 5, 6, and 7. So develop of the normative project and exposure of motives, design of mechanisms and implementation for compliance, and design of mechanisms to be able to track, supervise, and evaluate the regulation. So in this case, I'm also going to check, the citizenship to understand, the regulatory project. This is going, the entity is going to go to the regulatory quality committee, and we're going to bring these observations, have an audit, and with that final decision, that's when we're going to go through to the final approval on the sector, by the sector or whoever's responsible for that approval. What is the strategy and what have we been doing? These are kind of the phases of what we've been implementing, the steps. First, we're going to have prep. We're going to really strengthen capacities. And this is going from 2021 to 2023 because we're going to incorporate it on the regional government as well. The implementation of RIA in pilots. We already have 10 pilots and that have these capabilities. And now we are having as well some meetings of technical assistants so that they can go there and ask any questions if they need it, and they can follow this methodology in a practical way. So learn it by doing it. And also the mandatory implementation that is going to happen from July 2022. And we're going to start this phase of, capacitation for all entities on the first group that is going to apply this implementation of RIA. The participation of the private sector is actually a very important topic, and I believe it's going to also enrich. Sorry, Miriam, I'm sorry to interrupt. I have to control time right now. We only have a few more minutes, okay? Okay, I'm moving towards the end. So the private sector, we're creating a consultative commission. We also have an agenda, as I said, so we have public consultation, and we're going to be able to have the private sector participating in this process. What are the challenges that we have here for RIA? We want to make sure that it's a sustainable reform. So for the government to contribute with the strengthening of capabilities, with technical assistance, and this is what the regional governments do because it has to be a systematic application at the entire government level. We are preparing this as well, and what we finally want is to improve our standards at an international level. That's at the end goal. We want to make sure we're going to, fulfill everything that the World Trade Organization recommends and improve all of our recommendations. So now, these are the documents that I mentioned. You guys can review them in more detail. They are in the presentation. And finally, I would like to leave you with this reflection. It's the interventions and their results that are going to define a modern state. And if this is not based and focused on people, it's not going to work. And with that, I would like to thank you so much for the invitation, and I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Miriam. It's actually very interesting. Your presentation was great because it shows us the concrete actions that we are doing and the government is moving towards to be able to introduce this, these good regulatory practices that obviously are focused and surrounded by policies and several characteristics that are very important in institutional terms and can create tools, like you mentioned, of the regulatory analysis. I would also like to highlight what you mentioned on your presentation about the need for there to be a coordination, interinstitutional and intersectorial, so that we can have this coordination allowing for convergence of good regulatory practices in the entire public and private sectors. So like you say, Miriam, now we start with a strategy of 10 pilots, but the idea is for July next year, we're able to start with a more general application on all entities, in which, of course, the health sector is a key actor. And of course, on the health sector and on the medicine sector, I would like to go now to Cindy Vasquez, who's going to tell us what are the main challenges, what are the opportunities that are here related to good regulatory practices in the medicine sector. Cindy Vasquez is a lawyer. She started in corporate law by the University of San Martin de Porres. She has specialization in pharmaceutical law by the University of Cayetano Heredia, and she's currently in a master's program for corporate law in the Catholic Pontifical University in Peru. She has professional experience of over 6 years in the health field, currently working in Medtronic as legal advisor for the South Latin America region, formed by Argentina, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, and Paraguay, and Bolivia, and legal regulatory connection for Latin America. Cindy has previously worked as lawyer in Química Suiza, managing the legal aspects of the distribution and manufacturing activities for the Quicorp Group. Welcome, Cindy, and now please, you have the floor for your presentation. Thank you so much, Jean Paul. I'm very happy to be here with all of you and Medium. Thank you to all our organizers for the invitation. And I would really like to talk about, the industry point of view and what are the challenges and opportunities we've been having on the regulatory convergence in Peru. Before starting with a short presentation, I would like to talk a little bit about two sides that are very relevant that call my attention. Global Share Intelligence, that is a consultant that does a lot of studies on this sector in Latin America. There was a publication done on what are the 5 more relevant data of health in Peru, and two things caught my eye. One of them is that in 2015, there was an evidence that the government had inverted 5.5% of the GDP in the health sector, when the World Health Organization recommends that the minimum that should be done is 6% of the GDP. And this trend was maintained a little bit in 2015, 2019, before the pandemic. And the second thing that caught my eye was an organization of the World Health Organization, about organization in several countries. And Peru was located in number 62 out of 99 countries. So with this two information in mind, the World Health Organization had a document that talks about the resolution and strengthening of the regulatory system for medical products. And they had a very interesting topic. The efficient regulatory systems are an essential component for the strengthening of the health system and contribute to better health results. So understanding a little bit about this assumption, yesterday we talked a little bit about bilateral agreements and everything that Peru has done. And the most relevant one is the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, called the TBT agreement, created by the World Health Organization, and it started in 1995. Two main goals is that first, all member countries were going to not apply technical regulations that could generate obstacles and barriers to all international countries and commerce, and they just want a technical regulation that is necessary. So it is mandatory to have that. And when the technical regulation is being created, it has to be based on international frameworks. So this that happened in 1995. Other than that, Peru had a Supreme decree in 2005 called Regulamentary Dispositions of the TBT Agreement. But it was mainly about two aspects, which are the requirements that could affect international trade and imports as well. We were saying that this Supreme decree was related to economies and finances and should be approved by all the involved sectors. And the regulations products should be published in El Peruano, which is a Peruvian publication. And it should be related to the World Trade Organization and the Andean community. So what is this about? Why did I bring this here? It brings two questions. Isn't it a bit contradictory that on one side, the Peruvian state is compromised to not, reducing the amount of technical barriers, and on the other hand, it's going to create, with its internal framework, the only thing that is being regulated is that what is the process of publish and approval of the frameworks and not the process? A little bit about what Medium was talking about, the analysis of the structure of how it is going to be regulated. And then if all the projects should have been notified to World Trade Organization and the Indian community and other organizations, if that's the case, were these comments adopted or not from these organizations? So there is no public information about these questions that could confirm or deny that this happened and this was reviewed throughout the years. Now, landing a little bit more on medical devices in Peru, which is my sector, we have as a law, the law of pharmaceutical products and medical devices that was created in 2009. It was on Supreme Decree of 016/2011, and it analyzes all the modifications of this regulation. At least between 2012 and 2020, it was changed 11 times directly. And here I'm saying directly that we have in the sector of medical devices several norms and frameworks that directly or indirectly can affect the regulation of devices. As we can see, price observation, vigilance, regulation, or changes to the regulations that can affect anything. If we do review or see the Supreme Decree and other information that we can see of medical devices on the government, we can evidence that the attachments of this regulation on those that were previous consultation to all the agents that were involved. And also there is a matrix where we can see what were the comments, observations that were raised on the sector, in the industry sector, chambers, and also the answers that were received from other sectors and how this was done. Unfortunately, the same action and management is not seen on the changes of regulations that happened on future years.
Because of this framework for regulatory aspects for medical devices, we can apply it for the commercialization of the medical devices, some of that are specific for commercialization, and other criteria that after commercialization in terms of technovigilance. And here it would be this challenges I would see in terms of the Peruvian regulation for the sector of medical devices. First of all, we have some international agreements that are not being used in the most efficient way. We have constant standard changes. And so there has a relevant impact because the authorities have a mandate to solve a problem, and they have to have a framework to make their work in a transparent and efficient way. We also have procedures that are little flexible, that increases the administrative workload and limits the access to a certain technology, to a certain market. We also have a regulation based on the manufacturing of the devices. And an aspect here is related to analyzing when regulating and when not regulating. When you consider the medical device sector, the country is not a manufacturer We have a sector of fabrication, of course, of manufacturing that is interesting in terms of technology and emerging aspects, but it's not prioritary. The prioritary is imports and commercialization of medical devices. So when you regulate, you have to cover both activities in the correct aspect, the correct way. During the pandemic, the Catholic University, together with other private institutions, developed a mechanical ventilator. And this ventilator had a registration in an emergency manner in this state of emergency in a specific situation for the country, and that's why it obtained the sanitary registration. So otherwise, the standards would expect to have so many other requirements to be able to have the sanitary registration. And the technology they developed is part of the initiatives that have to be generated to incentivize the Peruvian market. Otherwise, it would have been lost. So when we regulate, we have to keep in mind what we want to regulate and what the market looks like so far. There is also a confusion between medical devices and pharmaceutical products. Of course, they are kind of cousins, but they have different characteristics. So when we regulate, we have to define the qualities of each of these sectors and not only consider the health sector as one thing alone. So we have to have in the biddings, the public biddings, the definition of pharmaceutical products and the separation with medical devices. And there is an absence of agreements to exchange information with other regulatory agencies that would allow us to adopt good regulatory practices, the same as the ones used internationally, and achieve a regulatory convergence. An important thing of the PCM of 2021 talks about the quality of the Peruvian regulation, and they mentioned that it's lacking resources and capacitation in all the sectors. So the topic is here institutionality. And what are the opportunities for regulatory convergence? Of course, you don't have to get all of them, but some good regulatory practices in the aspect of medical devices and medical products in general are these one. One, the opportunity of participating on agreements of information exchange and collaboration with other regulating agencies in the region, in the US and the European Union, because we have a great market we can be a part of. We can include the regulatory framework for medical devices in the national health policy, because the state has a core role in the management of the health of the Peruvian people. So if we add our medical device regulatory framework in this national policy, this is going to become an important tool for managing the access to technology for the patients. And the third point is consulting the stakeholders. We have to consider the academia, the medical societies, the patient societies and associations, and the industry. We have to define regulations according to the risk and the benefit of the device, which has to do with more than just considering the therapies the medical device could be used, but also the risks and the benefits related to not having the device in the market as well. Also regulating with the terminology being clear and flexible. So what we can do is respond more quickly to emergency situations as we did in the pandemic, and also measure and examine holistically the regulatory frameworks. And it has to be done not only holistically, but constantly. And I would like to conclude with one idea. The pandemic has left us with good and bad things. And one of the main things we learned with the pandemic is that we are all in the public health system, and we have the obligation of being agents of change and start the debate about what are the best practices we should have, because what should be the focus in the discussion would be generating access to patients. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Cindy, for the presentation. I also believe it's very important what you mentioned, because it shows the weaknesses a regulation applied to the devices can have, and the sanitary regulations in general. There are some topics we could mention here, and I believe the first one should be something directly related to the regulatory framework. And you can see that the holistic view is important, because otherwise you have laws and regulations and they don't respond to the goals of a public policy. The goals are not clearly defined. So we have to consider that the standard and ends up creating silos, and it lacks coherence. On the other hand, in the health sector, you need multiplicity, you have different stakeholders, and it requires coordination, a clear coordination, an institutional coordination to understand the distribution of the objectives of a public policy to achieve coherence and adequacy. And now we can go to the round of questions. I don't know if we have any questions so far, but I do have to go forward a question that we can ask Miriam and Cindy. To Miriam, one of the questions we have is, what concrete actions were done with the Ministry of Health or IG Meet for the implementation of the good regulatory practices that the Peruvian government is using? And then a question is, what could be the concrete mechanisms that the industry could use to get more actively involved in the development of the standards for the sector? Thank you, Jean-Paul. Effectively, when we have an evaluation of the pilots, let's say, for the implementation of this strategy, we consider specifically the health aspect. When we think of COVID and all the capacitation it implies, because it's a methodology that we don't learn overnight, there are so many components. We don't use in the Ministry of Health the same standards, and we somehow missed some opportunities. But by talking to Sandra today, we see this as an opportunity to start having maybe a second group of pilots, including the Ministry of Health, and we could have a deeper evaluation here. And also, we would get into topics like changes on projects of the laws of pharmaceutical products and medical products, or changes in the Supreme Decree 61. So we can start a methodology to improve what Cindy was mentioning is, let's evaluate if it's worth to regulate or not. So the methodology is mandatory, but it doesn't mean that we can't just start applying. And it's for your first question. And for the second question, on how we involve all the sectors and those that have to do and can intervene, we can think that the more you open the field for discussion of standards, more ideas we can have and a better solution we can achieve. So the important figure here would be the public consultation. Many entities are afraid of it because they say, oh, they are going to start giving opinions, and so they are not going to allow me to regulate as I want. But it is a valuable mechanism that allows us to have more elements of discussion and analysis of a regulation with a political decision. So that is the first thing. The private sector, the academia, have to get involved in this development and the analysis of public policies. Otherwise, we can't advance on this subject. Thank you, Miriam. And we have one question to Sandy, something that is related to the medication sector, and the question is related to the controls defined in the regulation for pharmaceutical products, where you have a control that's before the provision regarding quality practices, and it has to do with sanitary registration, to have an insurance of quality and security, and there's a control pre-commercialization. And then you have the National Center of Quality Control in Peru. And besides these controls, that would be ex ante control, you have an ex post control that has to do with the periodic inspections for the product. So what regulatory barriers that are in this aspect? What barriers the industry has observed related to making it more difficult for them access to the product or the commercialization? Thank you for the question. It goes together with another question received in the Q&A, which has to do with alternatives of regulation. And I believe one of the aspects is that medical devices are categorized in terms of risk. So one of the barriers we could identify is the lack of quick views of certifications that were obtained in the FDA or other entities. So these products, instead of having an homologation of these authorizations, you have to start from scratch with a series of documents and a sanitary registration that would get from 6 to 8 months until it's approved. So here you have a regulatory barrier that means that an authorization that was provided by another authority like an FDA or some other, instead of co-validating it, I submit it from scratch and I generate a delay for the commercialization of the products. And as you mentioned, you have to be realistic because the standard can generate other agents that are part of the evaluation of medical devices, but do they have the capacity of doing so? So we can see something that has happened in terms of the ventilator, for instance. How much management was involved in terms of public and political pressure for this ventilator to have a sanitary registration? So how much time we had to dilate so we could see an alternative in an emergency situation to have the product, the technology to relieve a reality that we were all experiencing, the lack of medical devices in public hospitals. So I believe the interpretation is each step of the process for medical devices have several bureaucratic barriers. But we can start with a first discussion, which is the commercialization. If you want to generate it as a priority of the government, and it has been discussed in this budget proposal, the topic of reinforcing, strengthening the health sector. And so instead of having it as an expense, there are mechanisms to have the access to medical devices, medical equipment in hospitals. Thank you, Cindy, for the explanation you provide on terms of regulatory barriers that are in terms of medical products. I don't know if there are any other additional questions.
Jean-Paul, tenemos un par de preguntas.
Yes, we have two questions. The first one is from Natalie Trejos, and it is for Cindy. Is it evident that we are not complying with international agreements in terms of the applicable regulation for medical devices? How can we do so? When a country is subject to an international agreement, they can suffer some sanctions. And we have to understand that this agreement of OECD, of the TBT agreement was applied by the government, and it was changed to pharmaceutical products and medical devices in 2009, and we are addressing it as part of the development of the policy of quality, regulatory quality. So we have this structure, and we have the opportunity of understanding holistically that our agreement requires some practices that in not all cases we are adopting, but is a matter for a discussion of everyone that is a part of the government and also the industry, considering let's look for a way and follow what we have committed to do, regulating what we should and project for a future for this to continue changing. So we are going to have other parts of technologies, and we have to be in a position of our frameworks to regulate for the future, or not just keep up with the delays in technology.
Perfecto. Jean-Paul, tenemos otra
Great.
pregunta.
We do have another question, Jean-Paul. We need more dynamic health institutions. Is it possible to request for us to promote DGMID to autonomous people? Does this depend only on the health ministry? I think maybe Miriam could give her opinion on this one. Yes, well, specifically the public management secretary has this topic of creation of, or reducing the state field of action. So when we are talking about this topic, where we have this analysis in the public sector, usually, let's say at this moment, we don't have any proposal on anything specific, but I think we could maybe create an analysis based on it. What I can say right now is that there is a trend of policies that are towards reduction of the state more than increase of the state. So we have a little bit of the initiative there of going to why we want to create this. And again, we need to have evidence. What is the cost? What is the benefit? We need to balance, and then with that, create the proposal. But as I'm telling you, a little bit about the alignments of the policies on both sides, reducing the state more than adding to it. Everything depends on sustainability, and if there's evidence that will show that one has more benefits than the other, one system has more benefits than another. Perfect. Yes. I think that now we are over our time for this panel. I would really like to thank so much Medium, Cindy. Thank you so much for your great presentations. And in my respect, I would like to thank you for the invitation and being the moderator for this panel. I would like to thank the Inter-American Coalition. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Jumbo. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Medium. I think now, we continue learning. We continue basically collecting knowledge that is going to allow us to act in a much more effective way and also collaborating in a more effective way with the government initiatives. And with that, before going to the next panel, I would like to appreciate the opportunity that I have of coordinating here to ask a few questions, specifically to Medium, actually. What is the most adequate mechanism for the coalition, companies, and other players in the private sector be able to have the hand to retrofeed the government related to the analysis of regulatory costs? Maybe we can talk about the topics that we identified, maybe recommending a solution. Of course, in our case, keeping in mind, we're talking about the communication line to DJ Meet. Is there any email that we can use to maybe get, and ask those questions? Or is there a mechanism for us to do that? Of course, Sandra. We are open from our public management. We are open to receive any suggestion, proposal. We were talking about it exactly. We also have our proposal that is going to be published in a few months of like a consultative committee. And the goal with that is for us to have a little bit of conformity. We want to have all players, so the academy, the private sector, general public. We want to have a commission that is going to allow for you to be able to make suggestions, proposals, give us evidence as to different mechanisms that we could be able to use to improve our process so that this system of regulatory improvement gets better. Because it's a process that it's not overnight. We don't think that in 2 years we're going to have the best regulations and everything will be perfect. No, it's a process that, very developed countries in this topic, they took like 20, 30, 40 years to finish. So we are now starting and we want to do this, in a consistent way. And we do need the interaction of all sectors that can support us in this reform. So welcome everyone. We welcome you, and I'm very happy with the proposal, and I would like to talk in private if possible. Thank you so much. Great. I think we have some topics that could need solutions that are quite simple, that not necessarily the normal processes would allow for us to access. So something that we have reviewed through the pandemic, basic topics that can be requirements for, just a signature, something like that could really solve a challenge in these pandemic moments. Electronic signatures are not allowed and they could really solve problems during the pandemic. Or maybe, specific documents when institutions weren't operating and we couldn't manage those documents because they're, really important documents to be able to access some products in the market. So some solutions would be relatively simple, and having this possibility of interaction, we believe that now it would be able to help and support to be able to find solutions. And in that sense, I'm going to finish my comment, talking again about the coalition and wanting to participate and collaborate in all processes, all training, capacitation processes, and all of these tools, like we had mentioned the past few days, specifically for our sector on DJ Meet and how we can manage this process to be able to advance in parallel, understanding the criticality that our sector still has to be able to keep supporting the pandemic, but also recovering from it, because of course, our authority, and it's not an exception, they still have a lot of pandemic topics going on, and this made a very important backlog, let's say, in what is required for the rest of the establishments to pay attention to. And this is still very current in many countries. So I would just like to say, how all members of the coalition want to collaborate with that, and we are going to be looking for spaces to be able to work together, Medium. Of course, Sandra, I would like to also invite you. When we start this first phase, I believe that, again, I would like to stress the private sector and the academy will be really important, because we have this early agenda as well. We have our entire schedule of what each sector wants, each regulator wants. We want to study this in the year to see if this can be a regulation. And one way of participation from the private sector, the academy and the social circle. So if this channel is open now, that's the time to participate. So what we ask you is for you to use this participation channel, for you to really put it to work, because we can have those there. But if we don't use them, then they don't have this effectiveness that we wish it would have. But well, thank you so much for all the questions, and hopefully we'll be able to keep working together. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Medium, and congratulations on all this effort that you're doing. And this is totally clear. This is co-responsibility. We can't keep blaming the government if there are mechanisms that are at the private sector's reach and we don't use those. It's co-responsibility, and we know that we want to help everything work, because this is for the patient's benefits as well. So thank you so much. And now let's continue, Sandra, so that you can help us present our next panelists. Thank you so much, everyone. Great. Good morning, everyone. This was a very interesting discussion, just like yesterday. Now I'm going to present the discussion table, which is going to be for regulatory quality control. Here we're going to have three doctors, Dr. Diego Gomez Flores and Dr. Claudia Lengua Zuniga, and they're going to present the ex-ante control. And ex-post, we're going to have Enrique Covero. So here we have, 20 minutes. And when we have 2 minutes to end, we're going to let them know, and we're going to try to finish their expositions in time so that we can have the time that each one needs to expose their presentation. So now I'm going to start with control ex ante, and they're going to start talking about Dr. Diego Gomez from University of Lima. He has a master of the Madrid University. Sorry, Sandro. Just one comment. Could you maybe start with Claudia? She's going to start and I'll be after her. Okay, I will present both of you at the same time, and then I will stop, and then I will present Dr. Cavero from the second part. Okay. So here the order is, it doesn't matter. She can go first, but I'll just present both of you. He has professional experience in administrative law, public service regulation, telecommunication, privacy, and personal data. He is a senior associate attorney for the telecommunication, media, and technology field on Hernandez and Company Attorneys, and from November 2018 till today. And author Claudia Lengua Zuniga. She has a bachelor's degree in law by the Catholic Pontifical University of Peru. She's an associate of competence and marketing law, information and new technologies, telecommunication, and intellectual property for Studio Hernandez and Company Attorneys. She specializes in personal data protection and administrative law. Go ahead, you have 20 minutes.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenos días, ¿se me escucha?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen.
Okay, perfecto. ¿Se puede ver?
Okay, great. Can you see it?
Sí.
Yes, we can see it.
Perfecto.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mi nombre es Claudia.
Good morning. My name is Claudia Legua. I'm an associate for Studio Hernandez and Company Attorneys. Today, on the last discussion of the day, we're going to talk about regulatory control in Peru and the analysis of regulatory impact, so RIA. And we're going to talk about the amount of regulations that can be implemented. Our presentation is going to have three great blocks. The first one, I'm going to explain what RIA is and the concept, trying to analyze the parallel of how it helps with quality control, and also explaining how this regulation helps in Peru. With that, let's start. RIA is basically a previous test to regulatory impact. according to the Supreme Decree 063/2021 PCM, it's a process that allows for previous analysis, systematic and integral analysis to identify, evaluate, and measure probable results, benefits, and costs for several alternatives and solutions, regulatory solutions and non-regulatory solutions for a public problem. Considering that, we consider an identification and analysis of risks to be able to adopt the best alternative of intervention based on solid evidence. According to the regulation, we should understand what set of legal laws are going to determine the participation of people or a company in a market. So the regulation has a very specific role on economic growth. The effective implementation of regulation can be positive if the design is appropriate, or can be negative if it's an inefficient solution. In this case, it would raise the cost of the law. According to OCDE, we can have the process of creating regulation can determine the reach of the effect that it's going to have and what is the goal. For that reason, we should have the best regulatory quality possible to be able to get efficient dispositions and to be able to predict any possible damage. So RIA is a perfect mechanism to improve the quality of regulation because it allows for an evaluation of consequences of disposition before that is done or before it can actually create damage. The main goal is to improve decision-making, to balance political policies in a way for different sectors. The parameters for us to check in RIA are very varied, and they can have social or environmental criteria. They have the needed capability to be able to analyze taxes, administrative processes, or having technical parameters established, among others. As we see, it's a very versatile tool that can be adjusted according to the criteria that a legal area wants to stress in specific. The RIA process is done typically on these steps. First, we have definition of the problem. So this is the starting point for the RIA analysis. Then we understand what is a public problem that we're going to try to solve with the implementation of that regulation. Usually, we can divide it into three categories: market failures, introduction and better distribution of resources, and protection of final consumers. This step also includes the identification of beneficiaries of the measures, whether they are direct or indirect. The next step is definition of the objects or goals of these evaluated policy. So what are the parameters that this measurement is going to be submitted to, considering that this is the total or partial solution of what was described in the previous step? Then the alternatives of regulation. This step is going to check what happened on the previous one and alternatives on concrete actions. So this comes on the state, and this can happen not necessarily having to be reviewed by that. So this is a way that we can have consequence actions of everyone that is registered, or we can have some that are not necessary. As a fourth step, we have evaluation of the impact. So we have a comparison between all alternatives of regulation and concrete actions, applying cost-benefit analysis or cost-effectiveness analysis. The costs considered in this section are the costs for us to fulfill the measure, the costs that we should submit to the administrative authorities for its application, and indirect costs such as actions of this measure. Then we have adequation of the regulation. As a result of the analysis, you're going to choose what is the measure and action that is most effective. It is important to say that this step should be executed as transparent as possible, making sure what is that you really say what is the decision that was chosen. Then we have monitoring and evaluation. So after it is defined, we need to make sure that the goals that are in the analysis are going to be reached, they are being reached, or if they could be reached in another way. After this, we're going to check a little bit more about the RIA ex ante evaluation in Peru. So this analysis was introduced on the Peruvian law through Legislative Decree 1448 in 2018, because it has 1310, number 1310, and it's the we're going to talk a little bit more about regulatory quality analysis as well, and that was introduced in this decree. So we can talk about the administrative processes of the executive power. RIA was already applied in Peru, considering the regulations of the TBT agreement, and it's very important. On April 3rd, 2021, we had another decree which introduces the regulation that is going to have the institutional framework that is going to create the improvement of the regulatory quality, and is going to try the ex ante RIA improvement. Then in July of this year, 2021, we have the manual of the approval of the ex ante regulatory impact analysis. In this context, we can see that it's a tool that was introduced almost 3 years ago formally, and it became more general over the years. According to Article 10 of RIA regulation, this should be applied to all normative dispositions in general character that establish, incorporate, or change rules, prohibitions, limitations, or any demands that may generate or implicate in costs of its application by companies, citizens, or general civil society. So RIA now is applicable to all public entities of the executive power. This field of application is preliminary because RIA is following an implementation plan. Currently, we are on the first phase, which is going to last until 2027. But little by little, we're going to expand into other activities, other entities and government levels to have a systematic improvement of regulatory quality. Then, this first step of implementation, RIA is going to be applied mandatorily to supreme decrees, law projects, and legislative decrees proposed by public entities of the executive power that are on this previously cited article. Then, this decree has 18 specific cases that are outside of the application goal of this. So, for example, we have the employees, entities, and others. These cases are described on Article 28 of RIA regulation.
Lo que es el proceso de presentación del proyecto regulatorio.
To see how the tool is used so you can reach the conclusions. The first one is the RIA expedient, where you have the evaluation, the conclusions you have, and the conclusions together with what you are going to obtain later on. And then you are going to have a CMCR evaluation, and you can even not approve the evaluation. After that, you are going to have evaluations that can be multi or bisectorial, and you can have the situation of the regulation being approved and getting into becoming effective.
Parece que perdimos.
Hola, sí creo que perdimos.
I believe we have lost our speaker. Diego, are you there?
Sí, a ver, dame un minuto. Voy a tratar de ubicarla.
Just a minute. Let me see what happened.
Estas cuestiones del internet. No sé, mientras tanto, Sandra, de repente podemos comentar algo.
So maybe Sandra, in the meanwhile, we can comment something. She said she had some technical issues. Would you like to continue, Diego, with your presentation? Yes, we can do that. So let's do that.
Perfecto. A ver, voy compartiendo la pantalla.
Let me just share my screen.
¿La pueden visualizar ahí?
Sí, ya se
You
ve.
can see it, right?
Ponlo en modo presentación, mejor, para que se vea mejor.
Please put in the presentation mode.
Se ve, pero no está en modo presentación. Falta.
Muchas gracias. Primero, muchas gracias.
So first of all, thank you so much.
Perdón.
En la parte de abajo
Ah,
hay
ok.
una
On the
pantallita.
bottom, you have the option.
Donde dice configuración de visualización, ahí a la derecha, la última es como tiene como una flechita con
The
cuadradito.
last
A la
one
derecha.
would be the one for that.
La otra.
Sí,
Dos más. Ahí está.
sí.
No.
Sí, ahí la ven.
No,
Como presentación.
no se colocó. Está en la misma. No se ha movido todavía.
Not yet. Let me try. Let us try again. It's the fourth item.
O sea, no, la vemos con los slides al costado, ¿no? Los slides chiquitos al costado. Ahora sí. Ya está.
Now we see it. Very good.
Ahora sí, ya se ve bien.
Ahí. Ahí sí. Ya.
Sandro, estás en modo silencio y creo que
Sí,
perdimos a Diego también.
Sí, perdimos a Diego también.
I believe we lost Diego too.
Bueno, creo que se tienen que volver a conectar. No sé si
I believe they have to go back.
de repente vamos a tener que
We may have to ask for Mr. Caviro to go back. Oh, I'm sorry, we have Claudia back. Yes, I had a problem with the internet. So please, you can continue. We're waiting for you. You can go back to your presentation.
Ok, me parece que ahí me había quedado.
So I believe I had stopped here.
¿Sí pueden ver la pantalla?
Sí, sí.
You can see my screen, right?
Entonces, como estaba mencionando,
So as I was mentioning, in the case of regulatory project being submitted to sectorial analysis, you are only going to have to go through the CMCR evaluation and later on it can be approved. On the other hand, if it's a multi-sectorial project, it has to go through the CCV evaluation and then through the board of the ministers. And once you have the second approval, you can get to the evaluation and it can become effective. Just to conclude, from all they mentioned, we see the RIA is a tool that allows us to evaluate the effects, alternatives, and the costs of a regulatory proposal before it becomes effective. In the first phase of implementation, we see there is the right path to a general improvement of the regulatory quality on the behalf of the entities. And with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. I don't know if Diego could come back. Oh, I believe we have him back. So now, Diego, Claudia has just concluded. You can start.
Ahí se puede visualizar.
Lo vemos como, o sea, se ve, pero como te digo, con los 4 slides al costado, ¿no? Chiquitos.
¿Lo pueden ver?
Sí.
Lo podemos ver, Diego. ¿Quieres que yo
We can see,
proyecte?
Diego, do you want
para
me
que
to
apretemos menos
share your screen so we can use less of your internet band?
Sí, por favor. Sí, por
Yes,
favor.
please, let's do that.
Entonces,
Por
sí,
favor, gracias.
ok. Si puedes dejar de compartir tu pantalla para que pueda yo compartir la
So
mía.
please stop sharing your screen so I can share mine.
Ok,
Great, perfect.
entonces. Me avisan, por favor, si pueden ver mi pantalla.
Please let me know if you can see my screen.
Ya se ve tu pantalla.
Yes, we can see it. Perfect.
Listo, adelante, por favor.
So now we're ready to go, Diego. Thank you.
Gracias, Sandra. Bueno,
Thank you, Sandra. And so within the framework for regulatory quality and the regulatory improvement in Peru, we are going to talk about one of the tools for regulatory quality analysis.
acá, un pequeño resumen de
Here, a summary
instrumentos de calidad
of the instruments of regulatory quality that exist. So we have the Decree 1448 from 2018, where you compile several of the tools for regulatory quality and improvement in Peru, where you have the administrative simplification, the regulatory impact analysis, and the regulation and procedure costs. So here, these are not all the instruments that exist in our regulation. These are the main ones, the ones that we use the most inside the regulatory quality and improvement analysis. We are also going to talk a little about this, how this tool is born in Peru. And I mentioned this one because it compiles the most important ones in a general aspect. So what is the regulatory quality analysis, what we call ACR in Spanish or RQA in English? So it's an ex post evaluation considering the characteristics of all that. So I would like to start by saying that the RQA has two modalities, the ex ante and the ex post modalities. And so it enters in the evaluation for the normative instruments ex ante, which means before they become effective. And then it is very similar in this aspect with the RIA. And then it aims at checking the efficiency of a regulation. And it also has an ex post modality to evaluate the regulation that is effective, that is being used in the market and already has effects. So the difference between RIA and the RQA is that RQA is focused on standard instruments for public agencies. So what we see are the procedures that are, for example, with public entities inside a single text, the ones we called TUO, the homologized texts in Peru. And so for other cases, we have the ex post evaluation. But this RQA has the evaluation of administrative procedures to consider if they are redundant or if they are adequate or not to the homologized text or the general law of administrative procedure to identify or reduce administrative workloads. The first point is what does RQA does is to define procedures, any procedure that contrariates the law. It's a procedure that is considered illegal. So we can get at least to something more grounded. With public entities that have procedures that may have different names, but with the same objective. So the RQA standardizes two procedures or either eliminates one of them. So that kind of function is what the regulatory quality analysis does. So we have all public entities, the ministries under this regulation. There are some procedures that are necessary. They have a defined means, a defined purpose, and they are valid. But the second field of action the RQA has is decrease administrative workloads. And the classic example would have the administrative requirement that have 10 administrative procedure that has 10 requirements in a moment that you would make 5 requirements enough. So you have to assess the procedures to make them quicker, more seamless, and more timely sometimes. And of course, there are two modalities. In both, you have the quality of the multi-sectorial aspect to validate, observe, or eliminate one of or more of the administrative procedures, because they are born through a project of a supreme decree. So what's analyzed here is this supreme decree. But the analysis that takes place is the analysis of its objectives. So we consider the criteria, the goals, and you have 4 main principles: the principles of legality, of need, of effectiveness, and of proportionalities. These are the ones that regulate public administrations in general. And so they are the base for general laws of the administrative procedure. So first of all, the principle of legality, the public administration is based on that, and we can't get away from this principle because the entities that act under this prerogative have to be aligned with this principle. And of course, all the supreme decrees, all the standards have to respect the Constitution and the laws of superior rules. And also you have the principle of need. So the necessity, well, what the procedure does, is it really necessary? Is there duplicity of procedures? So is there a necessity to create a procedure, to have a procedure, to do we need a new procedure if we already have a procedure for the same purpose? So we may eliminate one of them. And then you have the principle of effectiveness. So the strictly necessary, not generating administrative workload, more administrative work anyways. And so procedures that demand or expect some requirements that are not necessary and they are just more costly. So the procedures are supposed to be effective, which means quick, and they have to meet an objective, the objective they are created for. So this is the nature of all the regulatory improvement, to meet objectives in a proportional way with the principles that don't exceed its requirements or any kind of principle. And then the principle of proportionality is to consider the information and the reduction of administrative workloads. So when a public entity defines our goes through our RQA, ex ante or ex post RQA, or when they're going to create a new procedure, administrative procedure, they have to follow these 4 principles. They have to assess if those principles are okay and together define if the procedure meets or doesn't meet the needs, the effectiveness, the legality, and the proportionality. And so in those principles, you have the RQA. Here, you see a summary of how the instruments of regulatory improvement has been created. So we have different standards. We have the Decree 1310 of 2016 that generates the obligation to apply the RQA for the entities in the executive power. And so we have this image of the RQA being created, and then we change the mother law, the decree, a transversal law for public management, and you define the mandatory use of the RQAs in Decree 1452. And you have a very short, very brief article that is important because it generates the obligation for all public entities. And then in 1446 is in the framework of the administrative system for modernization of the public administration, and you really have this support, this encouragement to the improvement of regulatory quality. And then finally, the Supreme Decree is really applied in this RQA. And here I have a public document when the people that spoke before me mentioned that is a document from the PCM, the Secretary of Public Management, talking about the benefits of the RQA. And you see the benefits of the RQA to improve the competitiveness and the dynamics of the economy, decreases the unnecessary costs, prevents corruption, improving transparency, and allowing access to up-to-date information, which enables a good supervision and fiscalization.
Pero creo que es importante, el más importante
All
es
of
el
them
tema.
are important here, but I think that what is more important is what we have of most necessary. So everything that generates costs to what we're managing, but I think it's also important that public administration actually understands these types of tools and puts them to use. Because on topic 3, public servers are going to have more elements to be able, and more tools and better criteria to establish and create frameworks. I think this is a very important topic as well. And obviously, prevention to corruption, this is very important as well. And after, on the same document, here I have a few numbers that I would like to mention that are also important. So for example, of the RQA that was done in 2018 and finished in 2019, in this period, we were able to evaluate 2,432 administrative procedures that were done and they were approved on the PCM. So if we see a little bit below that, If we go a little bit below on the page, we can also see some other data.
Perdón. Sí, ¿me escuchan?
Can you hear me?
Sí, ese es
Yes, we can hear you.
última diapositiva.
It's the last one.
Sí, sí, perdón, se me había
Sorry,
Sí,
sorry, I thought it was wrong.
digamos, de estos procesos,
So the results that we can see on
de esta revisión del stock de procedimientos
this
administrativos
review of the administrative procedures,
que emitió, ¿cuáles fueron los resultados? Y acá creo
which is what was created, what were the results? And I think that these are results that are very important and very, very solid. So they can impact around 4 million people, organizations, and companies. Other than 73% of procedures have impacts in small, medium companies. This is very important and it's really impacting. Application of RQA allowed for a reduced administrative load, which implicated on a reduction on 286.3 million. That is going to favor, people, companies, and other agents in society. On the first time, we had the recognition of stock on the executive power. And as I said, with these tools actually help public administration a lot. Administrative personnel and public entities have a lot more tools, and they have a lot of more defined criteria to be able to create frameworks and administrative procedures. So I do think that's important. And Peru really improved their development for compatibility. This happened in 2019. And this final data that I think is also very important, 1,439 administrative profile procedures were validated, 734 were eliminated. So they weren't working in compliance with the validation requirements for RQA. So it wasn't going to work. Maybe they weren't necessary, maybe they weren't proportional. And that is very important because that is a very strong impact. And 1,302 requirements were eliminated and simplified. So the procedures were more simple, they were much more effective after this. They removed unnecessary barriers and administrative loads. And as we saw, the RQA, or this regulatory quality analysis instrument, still needs a more awareness of public administration. I think now we are looking at results on this application, and I believe that this was done correctly by many public entities. And I think that at this step, we are already getting very sensible benefits. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Diego Gomez. Now for control ex post, Dr. Enrique Cabero. He is a lawyer as well by the Catholic Pontifical University of Peru. He has a master's in competence and intellectual property law by the same university. He's a partner in competence and market law, information and new technologies, telecommunications, and intellectual property for Estudio Hernandez and Company Attorneys. He was recognized by publications such as Chamber and Partners, Legal 500, and Leaders League, among others, in his fields of specialty. Dr. Cabero, please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you so much.
Dr. Cabero.
Dr. Cabero? Okay. Hi, how are you? I believe you're on mute. Okay, now. I can't hear you. I don't know what's happening. I can't hear you. Now?
No. Todavía no podemos escucharlo.
No, we can't hear you.
Enrique, si nos escuchas, no sé si quisieras...
Enrique, if you can hear us, I don't know if you want to try communicating via phone.
Ok.
A ver que se conecta.
Okay.
Al costado del mute a veces hay una flechita que ahí
Maybe, you know, when we have mute, there is a little arrow with a lot of
el auricular.
microphones. Since you're using headphones, I don't know, maybe that's the case.
Tenemos unos segunditos que se arreglen estos problemas técnicos.
Just a few minutes, we're having some technical issues.
De repente sin el auricular. Si le quitas
Maybe
el
you
auricular.
try without your headphones. Maybe like that way we can hear you directly from the computer.
¿Podemos hacer algo desde aquí nosotros,
Can
Sandra?
we
¿No?
do anything from our side, Sandra?
Justo eso es lo que estábamos viendo, pero no.
Yeah, this is what we were checking, but I don't think so. Hello, we can hear you. Perfect, we can hear you now. Sorry, I'm so sorry. I feel like today all the technical issues are happening, right? No, it happens all the time. Don't worry about it. Okay, perfect. So Sandro, Sandra, hello everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. And well, we're a little bit behind on time, so I'm just going to go straight to the point here. I'm just going to go straight to the presentation. I will share my screen.
No sé si la pueden ver.
I don't know if you can see it. No, not yet. Oh yeah, now we can see it. Perfect. If you could just put it on presentation mode, we can see the regular mode. I think there's a small delay with the image. Just a second. Now you can see it, right? Yes, now it's perfect. Okay, perfect. I'm going to talk about removing technical barriers, bureaucratic barriers. This is a way of having ex post control of regulation. And that's why I'm going to talk about the system, which is a very interesting system. We heard Claudia, Diego talking about ex ante control manners. And in the seminar, we also heard about different ways to have, quality control for the regulatory analysis. And what can we, I'm going to talk about what can we do to be able to create the regulation in general and to make this regulation a better quality regulation. So the thing is, when this doesn't work, and we already have a regulation that is already created, that is already working, and it's not good regulation. Let's say it's regulation that maybe is illegal, or maybe it's irrational, inefficient, and it may even generate unnecessary problems to the market agents. So in Peru, we have this control of removing bureaucratic barriers. And this is very important. It's not something that you're going to see in other countries. In other countries, they have constitutional controls through judicial actions, but a control of elimination of bureaucratic barriers like we have here, I have never seen it before. Last time I checked, there was nothing like that exactly like we have here in Peru. I don't know if there is in any other countries, but it's something very general, but it seems like something beyond And it seems like a really good alternative to be able to try to eliminate bureaucratic barriers and inefficient regulations, anything in general that is illegal or maybe too general. What is a bureaucratic barrier? So the Legislative Decree 1256 defines bureaucratic barriers as any demand, requirement, limitation, prohibition, or charge that is going to impose to any entity of the public administration that is leading them to condition, restrict, or create obstacles to access or permanence of economic agents in the market. So it's a bureaucratic block barrier to the way that the agents usually operate in the economic market. This is just a general block. So I think that the definition is kind of broad and can be applicable, and it is applicable to any type of regulation, which is illegal or anti-technical. Now, there are a few things that are not qualified as bureaucratic barriers and can be combated on this system. Mainly the laws. On the system, you can't go against a law, of course, but they can go against the other laws that are not as highly ranked. Basically, the norms that we have and the frameworks that we see in contracts and on these processes and public contracts, and some other exceptions that are specific that we can have here. For example, omissions, directions, when something is just taking a long time, when they constitute a problem or a block for, entrepreneurs, that is considered a bureaucratic barrier, or something that is not according to the administrative functions. I'm not going to take too long talking specifically about, phytosanitary measures and taxes and all that, because basically we do have these frameworks and norms as well, and some of them are not linked to that. So we can't really ask, again, I say that because usually we have that law happening, and the sanctions that we can have on public administration cannot be questioned. Although we can question the norm and framework based on which we put forth that information. Yes, that we can do. In general, so that I don't take too long, bureaucratic barriers are these demands, requirements, demands that come and they are included on this administrative acts or even material complaints, and that they don't come from a norm or framework with a range of law. So it's beneath that range of law. They are maybe imposed by entities that are working on public administration in general, on the exercise of administrative function, and that have some type of general barrier or obstacle. But the bureaucratic barriers, I have to say, they can have two types. The ones that actually come from regulation, which is what we have been talking about, the regulatory quality and all that. It's a regulation that is manifested in a framework or a norm. But also, if they're not in a norm, but they have demands that, on day-to-day life, in practice, they do ask administrators to have that information. And these can also be combated through this system, which means they're asking for something that is not in any regulation. So we're not even saying that the regulation is anti-technical or illegal. There is no regulation. And if there is no regulation, maybe they're requesting things that shouldn't be requested and all that. So that type of barrier, which happen a lot in day-to-day practice, where administrative acts, like I said, are also in this system. And well, the barriers can have two types. They can be illegal. So when you exceed competence, when the administrative authority can impose some type of regulation, or they're trying to regulate things that they couldn't because, it's not part of their competence. This happens a lot. Public servers have the duty of limiting their actions to whatever is strictly their competence. So public servers, the difference between private ones that can do everything which is not forbidden, public ones can't. Public employees can only do those things for those which they are authorized to do. So let's say we have organic laws, the functional laws, and all of that tell the public employee what they can do. If they leave that range, then they're exceeding their competence, and the fact that they're regulating something that it's not, in their competence, it's something very difficult. Now, more than that, there is a norm that somehow is going to go against something that we have in the legal area. So these norms cannot be considered on these bureaucratic barriers. But it can happen with all the norms that are going beneath that range of law. Maybe they are going against the authority, or they are contradicting it somehow. They're having some type of incompatibility with legal norms of any other type. So this is, something that can happen, and it is an illegal bureaucratic barrier. And the other topic is also when they're not respecting procedures and formalities to be able to put this forth. As we have already seen before, as part of the topic, to be able to fulfill formalities and to continue to approve norms. Of course, if these procedures are not, complied with, and the norms can be questioned through this system of bureaucratic barriers elimination. But it's not only the illegality that we can question, but we can also question the reasonability. So it could have been a legal regulation. It could have been published with everything according to the law, but maybe it's inefficient because it's not justified in public interest, for example. Maybe it's too connected to the competence of the authority, or maybe there is a more efficient way, which is, less work, that is going to generate less obstacles or less barriers to the administrators, which can have the same or better results with, less work, less blocks, less barriers. So this is what we usually call a law that doesn't have reasonability. Of course, this is something related to a more complex analysis, but we can also question this type of not only illegality, but also regulations that lack reasonability.
¿Cómo funciona esto? ¿Se hace una denuncia en
So how does it work if we have in the committee, the first instance in the commission, we have a technical secretariat, and then it would be the second instance in terms of claims, and the entity of public administration that has been mentioned there can go to a second level to remove bureaucratic barriers, and the procedures can be from one party. So each administrated party being impacted by the administration can do that, or an entity, or it can be as an office, let's say through documents from a technical secretary. In a party kind of procedure, it can be presented individually by each administrative party, or it can be presented collectively. Different parties or even some organizations, representative units. Sometimes we know one administrative party that is impacted by a legislation specifically doesn't want to present a report, a claim, because they don't want to be against the entity they need to talk to or relate to every day. They need their authorizations, the entity that is its regulator. So individually, they don't want to present a claim because they think they may produce some kind of response or kind of negative impact. But also they can happen through a collective. And also in a way that you can start procedures through their own technical secretaries. They have the kind of informative claims. So the affected party doesn't state the claim formally, but just presents this claim in an informative way. So they provide the information for the institution to go through the procedure. And so in this indirect way, we can have the copy to start a procedure, analyze the standard, and apply some changes if applicable. And it leads us to the consequences. I haven't mentioned before, but what could be the results of a procedure, of a bureaucratic barrier? You have then a definition that there is a bureaucratic barrier and that it is because the procedure, the legislation is illegal or it's not adequate. And so just one example to give an idea of what a bureaucratic barrier is, we can have, for instance, we have the entity DIHESA that requests additional studies to the TUPA for the sanitary authorization. So we have technical analysis, you have requirements that are not defined in the TUPA. So if it's not part of the TUPA, it is an illegal barrier. So through a claim of bureaucratic barrier, it says that this requirement is not applicable. And it's easy to identify it. Another example would be, for instance, the entity INEI, and it requests the applicants to provide financial balances, but such information is available in the SUNET. So the entity has to make use of the public information they already have before asking it from the administrative parties. So they can make and must share that information before asking that information from the administrative party. That's the idea. And you have the law of administrative simplification to subside it. You have here a case of an expense. So you have 390 souls for the fees or taxes that are not binding through this procedure. But the binding fees what we consider the fees, the tariffs that some public administration bodies charge, they have to be related to the cost of a service. The costs cannot be above 350 or 400 souls. So that kind of barriers is one of those that is easy to identify, because the entities charging for a price is charging for a service that is not proportional to the cost of that service. Here we have another example in terms of the obligation of renewing a record when for a course, for instance, when the course has not gone through any changes, like a license. So here is a registration for a sanitary product, for instance, and then you have a cost that makes no sense because there is no objective reason for the renewal if the legislation hasn't changed. So there is a change here. A change in the legislation would justify, but it's not the case. So here we have some emblematic cases. They are just for illustrational purposes. And so we have the case number 1, where you have the company Soyuz, a company of that has a transportation company that would have the limitation from the institution in the municipality that had the obligation, the requirement of just allowing the transportation of authorized users. But it had to do with how much you could demand. So how can you demand only authorized passengers? It would be something that would not be applicable. So the authorities have to act within their competence and within the reasonable. It has to be within their competence most of all. And then you have the technical review that has to do with public administration, and the city is using to hire one contractor because they have a contract with that party. And this is a case, I'm not going to get into the complexity of the topic, but to give the idea of how it works. And then you have ANDA, which is the National Association of Announcers. So you have all parties being a part of it, companies that are great advertisers. And they question the regulation on commercial promotions. Some years ago, before having a bureaucratic barrier, if each company to have a commercial promotion to give a prize in any sector, it needs to provide to ask for the approval of ONAHI. And there is a series of blocks to this process. So a group of administrative parties is asking for a package of regulations, and that had to do with reviewing the permits, the authorization, and what to do with the prizes that would not be collected by the winners, all sorts of obligations. So it was a public, a collective action that leaves aside and makes ineffective a whole set of legislations. And there is also the requirement of municipality of San Isidro, in this case, to have 14 parking spaces to have a permit for construction in a commercial place. If you don't have space for 14 parking spaces, you wouldn't have the permit for construction. So the point is, the municipality doesn't have the competence, the authority to provide that kind of demand. So it is defined as a bureaucratic barrier. So these are some of the key ideas, the challenges that are still pending with the regulation. First, the topic of public hiring. That is a little more specific, but it also has to do so. Inside the process of biddings, the public hirings, there is some kind of regulation, but sometimes the regulation is not the most efficient. But these kind of contracts have to be observed. There is a gray area in this aspect, and this topic needs to be perfected through some changes in law, and this is something that we have to consider. This is just for public contracting. Sometimes there are things that are not related to that, and they are okay with the system. Another topic, which is still pending and is a challenge for the regulation, is when there are endemic dispositions that can be solved through only one claim. So a municipality requires something that is out of place and constitutes as a barrier. So you make a request, you make a claim, you declare the bureaucratic barrier, and then you say to the municipality of San Borja, for instance, you can't do that. For instance, in San Isidro's topic of the parking lot, you can do that, but what about the aspect of the municipality? Because you decide on the San Isidro aspect, but other municipalities with similar requirements don't get solved. So you still don't have a way of being able to, for using a procedure to share standards or regulations that, when extinct formally, are identical to others. So it's still pending to find a way to do it. And the key challenge, I believe, and the main one right now, is the one about the time. So eliminating the bureaucratic barrier would have to be a quick procedure, but it's not. In practice, unfortunately, the commission takes place and takes too long to solve a procedure. But the truth is, these are not quick procedures. And if we don't start with debureaucratizing the process, we have to start by this debureaucratizing the body that causes, that works with the bureaucratization. So this system is still a system that, of course, works well, but it's a system that tackles very well the quality control, and it's well designed in an ex-post manner, and it's a good tool, and what is lacking is using it, and using it well, from the entities that are responsible for it. This is a problem that has to do with the application, the naming of employees that are adequate. And these are the challenges that are ahead of us. We need more resources for NDCOPE. And I conclude by saying that the important is to understand and get to know that there is a system of ex post control, and with all the opportunities of improvement, it is a system. It's a tool that can be very valuable to tackle illegal or inefficient legislations and regulations. Thank you, and I conclude my presentation. Thank you, Dr. Caveiro. It was very illustrative, and I'd like to compliment. And as the Chamber of Commerce, we have talked about the bureaucratic barriers, and we like the topic, and we have the case of DUPA. And we really noticed the time it took. And of course, we ended up with the solution, of course, but there is a case there, because from one day to the other, you can have changes or in tariffs or certificates of analysis, and sometimes a copy is 900 sold. So, you know, there are things that really require responses, and there are cases that had very good resolutions. But it's important what you said, that it's a system that only we have. And so it's important to see. We can perfect it, we can improve, enhance it, but yes, it's important. We still have some questions, so let me ask one. The second one, that it seems to be more related to what you have commented. And it has to say, you could understand as a barrier the change of interpretation of a normative requirement, having in consideration the standard. It has no changed?
Claro.
Of course, you could. Not the change itself. The change itself is not the topic. So never mind how yesterday was. If today they're demanding X and the norm doesn't say X, then that's a barrier, right? So this is a barrier that is reflected in an act. So what we can say is, if the norm doesn't say that and someone is demanding that, then the act of the demand in itself is illegal. They cannot demand it. And that happens because the employee doesn't have what it takes to comply with that, because it's not in the norm. So changing the interpretation to say what it says, and it was black and now it says white, and there's a change in interpretation, and clearly this is not something valid, right? So deep down, what the employee is doing is that they're trying to get an excuse to demand something that the law doesn't say. So yes, that is a barrier. Okay, and a question that came as well. So how long does it take or can take to solve this bureaucratic barriers? Well, again, it can take years. And this is one of just like the procedure that is usually processed quickly, right? So it can also happen. We can order the stars, like we say.
Se pueden dar relativamente rápido.
So things can move quite quickly when everything is aligned. And, we have some caution measures and all that can help. So this is a procedure that can happen relatively quickly. But unfortunately, there are some procedures that can take years, right? So it really will depend on a lot of factors, from if they have quorum, because many times, for example, some of the commissions have some type of conflict of interest or something like that. They don't have quorum and they're just they only change the employees after months.
hasta, digamos, las complejidades mismas del caso.
So until the minimum complexities of the case, like the simple cases and the more complex cases, for sure, it's very variable. But in general,
si bien hay una oportunidad, repito, de que
if they see an opportunity, and if there's an opportunity that this can be done quicker, and it should be done quicker, it's also true, and I insist that this is a valuable tool, and for good or for evil, it does a lot. And if everything is led well, it can really help. And someone says that if justice comes late, it's not justice, but I say that better late than never. Of course. Thank you so much, Dr. Cavero. Here there's a question that's specific for Dr. Diego Gomez. So it's from, well, about these eliminated requests, are they considered in TUPA? When you're eliminating these procedures, does it mean that you don't have to request the sanitary authority? I think it's about the last procedures that you mentioned on your presentation. That would be eliminated and all that. So how do we deal with that in case that happens? Well, then we have two options. To not eliminate requirements. I think the question is also about requirements in a procedure, right? So maybe we won't eliminate requirements or procedures, maybe if it's just a more effective or simple procedure. I think that's what they meant. But if we're eliminating a procedure, if we're completely eliminating one from TUPA, then the obligation or the right that is generated through the procedure somehow is not going to have the effect, right? But listen, it's what I mentioned. The procedures usually are eliminated many times because they're illegal or because there are procedures that, how can I say, they have duplicities. So this right on this procedure, maybe it's not related to another procedure, So I really need to check if we can specifically eliminate the obligation or the right in a complete way. But I'm talking in general terms. I'm not going into specific analysis of her case. It's just very general. Right, okay. Okay, Dr. Diego, thank you so much. Okay, so on my side, I would like to thank Dr. Claudia Lima, Diego Gomez, and Enrique Cavero. I don't know if Sandra has any additional questions, and I will go back to you so you can finish the topic. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you so much, Sandro. Thank you so much to all the participants for everything. I don't have any additional questions, which is weird. It's rare, but thank you so much for everyone who participated. And now, Sandro, if you want to just close, and then I will go ahead and really close the event. So I would just like to thank everyone. Thank you so much for coming. The entire day was really productive. When we're talking about bureaucratic barriers, we have a lot of topics and angles to explore. So it's always a new opportunity. I think the message is looking at the tools that we have to be able to make it easier and make it easier for the private company to be able to better manage itself in, tranquil waters and not turbulent waters like we used to. Or maybe trying to go to those spaces and finding those spaces so we can share this, because many times we don't know what the complexity is of what is being put forth in a norm, So sometimes this will work a lot more if we talk about it and if we go and personally want to see changes. So I think that's a good step to try to find. So that's what I want to say. Thank you so much. And Sandra, you can close now. Thank you. Thank you, Sandro. Great. I would like to, back up what Sandro said. Thank you so much for all participants in these sessions. We really hope that the knowledge that we have acquired here can help us have more efforts to advance in a more effective way towards regulatory convergence. We're sure that the health sector, specifically on medical devices, is in a privileged moment to make this way easier with everything that Peru has already developed. But recently we have published a lot of aspects on the application of good regulatory practices and good reliance practices like we saw yesterday, as well as international laws that are going to make it easier for us to develop regulations. And of course, are going to also make it easier for us to really go and comply with everything that is put forth by the World Trade Organization. In the next few days, you're going to receive messages on the coalition newsletters with the presentations that we shared over the 2 days. Thank you so much. Thanks again for your understanding. And, I'm sorry we went over time again, but we're going to tell you about our next events that are going to happen and are going to be coming up on this that we are going to do with the PCM to be able to continue developing competence. Thank you so much and have a nice rest of your day. See you next time. Thank you. Bye. Bye. Thank you.